The nature of my mental health issues started about 4 or 5 years ago. I started to suffer quite badly with depression and anxiety attacks. And the longer it went on, the worse the anxiety attacks got. And in spite of either trying to brush it off, trying to distract myself or trying to ignore it, it just didn't seem to go away. I just found that it started to affect my relationship with my family, with my children, and my concentration got really poor too. So it just got to that point where I think you tend to describe it as you feel as though you're drowning but everybody around you is breathing. And it was just that whole awareness of feeling really different and just kind of isolated from people. I think I'd been probably struggling with, I think I was struggling with work at the time. Things were a little bit, mad busy and a bit overwhelming. And my two children had both moved up to junior school. One was managing the transition over to GCSEs. He was having a really hard time at school and he was getting bullied. And my youngest was also moving up to junior school and finding that transition a bit of a challenge. And it just seemed to, the whole managing work-life balance just felt as though it was too much of a balancing act and things just felt completely overwhelming. So I think by the time I'd realised I was into it, I was practically asleep or irate, and it didn't seem to oscillate at any, there was no kind of middle ground between the two. So it just felt like one extreme to another, but I think that's how it built up. Whether that's the trigger or not, I'm not quite sure. There'd be times when I'd need to go to either a meeting or I'd need to participate in something and my heart just wasn't in it. So I'd either think about any possible excuse not to go and then end up talking myself around. But it was, that kind of thing is exhausting by the time you've finished just making yourself go through that process and gearing up to actually doing something that takes you really out of your comfort zone. So I think in that aspect it did. The work still got done, but it probably took me longer to actually get my head round about what I needed to do and concentrate and knuckle down. At one point I used to just think, oh, it'll be over, I'm just having a bad day or I'm just having a bad week, and then you realise that the bad week has gone on for an awfully long time. So no, I think it wasn't until I think I'd got to a point where I was practically so paralysed by my own thoughts. I'd just got completely stuck in a loop of the thinking process and I just wasn't functioning, and there were times when I'd just sit staring into space, not necessarily at work but at home, just with the idea of completing something that would be a really simple task like making a phone call, and I just couldn't do it, and I'd be just sat there with the phone in my hand and 10 minutes would have gone by and I still wouldn't have done it, but I wouldn't have done anything else in between. I just couldn't seem to mobilise either myself or my thoughts to actually make myself do something. And I think it was that point that made me realise that actually this isn't right. You shouldn't be feeling this way. It just shouldn't be this hard. I did seek help eventually. It took me a good long while, mainly because I'm quite a private person. I don't like talking about my feelings. It's not something I'm hugely comfortable with. And I think I ended up going to see my GP reluctantly. He was absolutely lovely. I mean, I've known him for absolute donkey's years, but he's the sort of person that you could just go and tell you could tell them anything. And he just said, this is normal. It's just your body and your hormones and your brain just trying to cope with something. So he did some blood tests just to make sure that all of that I was eating properly and that my body was behaving the way it should. He prescribed some antidepressants and said, give these a go. It's more of a sticking plaster, but it's something that will actually just get you through to the point where you're able to figure out what it is, what you want, and what the problem is, and where you need to go from that. It's just that bit that will give you that stability on the way there, and it's not as though you're not going to be addicted to it. Don't be afraid of taking medication to help you. He offered counselling, which I hastily refused and said, no, definitely don't need counselling, I'll be all right. So I went away and started on medication. It took a little while to get into my system, and it's one of those where it is a bit of a chemical change, but it did start to have an effect, even if it was just kind of having a bit of a blurring effect on the symptoms that I was having at the time. It's something that you manage. I think there are times when either you're under pressure or you're going through stressful periods in your life that it comes back. But once you've got over the first hurdle of talking to somebody about it, whether it's your GP or somebody you know, or a friend or a family member, or someone completely objective, because sometimes you don't always feel comfortable about admitting something that you think someone might think is a failure. But then once you've started talking about it, you start to recognise the pattern, and that is what helps you manage it. I've found that the more help you ask for, the amount of support that comes back is just incredible, because there's so many people that can relate to that experience, even if they don't have it on that same level. It's something that everybody will have gone through at some point in their life, and they know how you're feeling, even though you can't necessarily verbalise it yourself, and that makes such a difference.